The neighborhood of Maplewood Pines was one of those communities that looked picture perfect from the outside, lined with neat rows of identical houses, manicured lawns, and white picket fences. It had the kind of atmosphere that newcomers imagined when they dreamed of the American suburban life. But beneath that polished surface, it harbored the kind of drama and pettiness that could turn even the simplest acts into battles. Every December, the cul-de-sac became a contest of sorts. Families took pride in stringing up lights, inflating snowmen, and decorating their homes to spread holiday cheer. It wasn't an official competition, at least not one recognized by the HOA but to the neighbors. It might as well have been. And this year, everything started with one man's attempt to bring joy to his family. Daniel had moved into Maplewood Pines only 2 years earlier, with his wife and 2 young children. He wasn't the type to seek attention, but he loved Christmas. His childhood memories were filled with magical nights staring at twinkling lights, and he wanted to recreate that wonder for his kids. So, starting in late November, he spent weekends climbing ladders, hanging thousands of bulbs, outlining every edge of his house, and covering his yard with glowing reindeer and candy canes. The centerpiece of his display was a towering archway of lights that framed his driveway like a glowing tunnel, leading to a giant Santa sleigh display. It was dazzling, cheerful, and most importantly meant to bring smiles. And for most of the neighbors, it did. Families walked by at night just to admire it. Kids squealed with excitement, and even strangers drove from other streets to take photos. But not everyone appreciated Daniel's efforts. Directly across the street lived Karen. She had lived in Maplewood Pines for over a decade and saw herself as the unofficial enforcer of the community S standards, known for her sharp tongue, constant complaints, and uncanny ability to turn any situation into an ordeal. Karen had a reputation that no one envied. If someone's trash cans were left out too long, Karen had something to say. If a lawn was mowed a little too late in the evening, Karen made sure to file a complaint. And when Daniel's Christmas lights lit up the neighborhood, Karen didn't see joy, she saw a problem. It began with muttered comments. "Too bright," she grumbled, walking her dog at night. "Distracting," she snapped when neighbors gathered to admire the display. But mutters soon turned into action. One morning, Daniel found a letter stuffed in his mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from Karen herself. In the letter, she claimed his display violated community peace, threatened her property value, and was a safety hazard. She demanded he take the lights down immediately. Daniel ignored the letter at first. After all, most of the neighborhood loved the display. But Karen wasn't one to give up. She began calling the HOA daily, insisting they enforce non-existent rules against excessive decorations. When that didn't work, she started filming the display, muttering loudly about lawsuits, and even yelling at cars that stopped to admire the lights. For Daniel's family, what had started as a joyful project began to feel like a nightmare. His kids overheard Karen shouting and grew anxious, asking if they'd have to take down their Santa sleigh. His wife worried about the constant tension. But Daniel stood firm. This was his property, and his decorations broke no rules. Then, one chilly evening, a knock on Daniel's door changed everything. When he opened it, a stranger in a suit handed him a thick envelope. Karen had done what few expected. She had officially filed a lawsuit. She claimed the lights caused emotional distress, sleep disruption, and even dangerous traffic conditions from passing cars. She was demanding not only that the lights be removed, but also that Daniel pay damages for her suffering. Word spread quickly through Maplewood Pines. Neighbors were stunned, whispering in disbelief. Some secretly cheered Karen's boldness, thinking maybe she would finally get Daniel to tone things down. But most were outraged. Lawsuits over Christmas lights? It felt absurd, almost comical, until people realized it was very real. Daniel was forced to spend nights gathering documents, consulting with a lawyer, and preparing for a battle he never wanted. His dream of spreading cheer had transformed into a legal storm, all thanks to Karen's obsession with control. The holiday season in Maplewood Pines no longer felt merry. Every light twinkled under the shadow of a court date. Daniel's family tried to keep smiling, but stress weighed on them. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around the neighborhood with a smug satisfaction, telling anyone who would listen that justice was coming. Yet what Karen didn't know was that her lawsuit would unravel her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. Because sometimes, when you dig a hole for others, you end up falling right into it yourself. And as the year drew to a close, Maplewood Pines was about to witness one of the most shocking neighborhood showdowns it had ever seen. The lawsuit was in tea. Just a piece of paper. It was a storm cloud hanging over Daniel's household. Every time he glanced at the neat stack of documents on his kitchen table, he felt his chest tighten. He had moved to Maplewood Pines for peace and stability, not conflict. And yet, here he was, spending evenings combing through legal jargon, preparing to defend himself in a courtroom. All because one neighbor couldn't tolerate his holiday cheer. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on the attention. Word of a lawsuit spread quickly through the neighborhood Facebook group, where residents debated fiercely. Some argued that Daniel's lights were harmless, a tradition that brought joy. Others wondered if maybe Karen had a point. Were the displays attracting too many cars? Too much noise? Karen herself fueled the fire by posting long rants about how she was the victim of light pollution, how she had been forced to sleep with blackout curtains, and how her blood pressure was dangerously high because of the stress. But the truth was, Karen wasn't content to simply complain. She wanted to win. And to her, winning meant not just forcing Daniel to take down his lights, but making an example of him. She hired an attorney with a reputation for being aggressive, and she began parading around the cul-de-sac with newfound confidence, telling neighbors, "This will set a precedent. No one is above the rules." Daniel's lawyer, however, saw things differently. After reviewing the documents, she shook her head in disbelief. Karen's claims, she explained, were flimsy at best. There were no HOA bylaws restricting holiday decorations, no city ordinances being violated, and no medical evidence tying Daniel's lights to Karen's alleged distress. To put it bluntly, the lawsuit looked more like a personal vendetta than a legitimate case. Still, that didn't make the process any less grueling. Preparing for court required time, money, and energy that Daniel and his family didn't have to spare. His wife took on extra hours at work to help cover legal fees. While Daniel spent his evenings gathering testimonies from neighbors who supported him, he collected photos, HOA newsletters, and even statements from families who said the display had become a highlight of their holiday traditions. What made the ordeal worse was Karen's constant presence. Every night, as the lights flickered on, she would stand in her driveway with her arms crossed, glaring across the street like a watchful sentinel. Sometimes she would film, muttering to a phone about evidence she would present in court. Other times, she would march up to passing cars and demand they leave, claiming they were trespassing. It was harassment, plain and simple. But Daniel refused to stoop to her level. He focused instead on building his case, quietly determined to see it through. Then came the first pretrial hearing. The courthouse was small, but the tension inside felt enormous. Karen arrived in a tailored suit, clutching a binder thick with papers, her lawyer at her side. Daniel sat across the aisle, his lawyer calm but firm. When the judge entered, Karen straightened in her seat as though she had already won. But reality quickly set in. As Karen's lawyer laid out her claims, the judge's eyebrows rose higher and higher. Emotional distress caused by Christmas lights, loss of property value from seasonal decorations. The argument sounded less like a legal case and more like a list of personal grievances. When Daniel's lawyer presented the HOA bylaw, which clearly allowed holiday displays within reasonable time frames, the courtroom seemed to shift. What Karen had painted as a community crisis now appeared to be nothing more than a neighbor-esque vendetta. The judge didn't dismiss the case outright, at least not yet. Instead, he scheduled a full hearing, instructing both parties to return with evidence and witnesses. But the warning signs were clear. Karen's case was flimsy, and the more she pushed, the more it looked like harassment. Back in Maplewood Pines, the atmosphere grew even more divided. Some neighbors avoided both parties altogether, not wanting to be dragged into the drama. Others quietly rallied behind Daniel, offering to testify on his behalf. Families dropped off baked goods, cards, and notes of encouragement, reminding him that his lights brought them joy. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down. She claimed Daniel had turned the neighborhood against her, that she was being bullied, and that she would fight to the end. But Karen's crusade came with consequences. The legal fees piled up, and whispers circulated that she had taken out loans to cover them. Her relationship with other neighbors grew icy, as even her former allies grew tired of her theatrics. She filed complaints not just against Daniel, but against anyone who so much as parked near her house. It was as if the lawsuit had consumed her entire life, leaving no room for anything else. For Daniel, the stress was overwhelming. But there was a strange comfort in knowing the truth was on his side. His lawyer reassured him that Karen's case had no solid foundation. It would take time, but justice would prevail. And as Christmas approached, Daniel made a decision. He would keep the lights on, no matter what. So, on Christmas Eve, while snow fell softly on Maplewood Pines, Daniel's house glowed brighter than ever. Families came from near and far. Children gasped in wonder, and laughter filled the air. Across the street, Karen's house sat dark and silent, a shadow in the glow of holiday cheer. She watched from her window, seething, convinced that her day of victory was coming soon. But what Karen didn't realize was that the very case she had pinned her hopes on was about to backfire spectacularly. The new year would bring a courtroom showdown unlike anything Maplewood Pines had seen before, and when it was over, Karen would be left with nothing. The new year began with tension hanging heavy over Maplewood Pines. While most families were busy packing away their holiday decorations and returning to normal routines, the neighborhood's focus remained squarely on one event: Karen versus Daniel, a case that had transformed from petty bickering into a full-blown legal drama. The courthouse date arrived on a bitterly cold January morning. Frost still clung to windshields as cars pulled into the lot, but inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was anything but cool. Karen marched in first, her binder now bursting with even more papers, her lawyer trailing close behind. She radiated the smug energy of someone convinced that justice and attention were on her side. Daniel arrived more quietly. His lawyer carried a slim folder, neatly organized, but nowhere near the mountain of evidence Karen had amassed. Unlike Karen, who thrived on theatrics, Daniel had been instructed to keep things simple. Facts, not drama, would win the day. The hearing began with Karen's lawyer presenting her case. He spoke at length, arguing that Daniel's lights had caused emotional distress, property devaluation, and community disruption. He presented photos of the display at night, copies of Karen's medical bills, and even written notes about her alleged loss of sleep. To an outsider, it might have seemed impressive, but to the judge, it looked suspiciously like overkill. Then Karen herself took the stand. She painted herself as the victim of a campaign of torment, describing Daniel's lights as blinding, oppressive, and a deliberate attempt to humiliate her. She spoke of migraines, stress, and a decline in her health. At times, she even dabbed her eyes with a tissue, pausing dramatically to let the weight of her words sink in. But the more she talked, the less convincing she became. Her descriptions grew exaggerated, bordering on unbelievable. She claimed she hadn't slept a full night in weeks, that cars lined up outside her house until dawn, and that she feared for her safety every evening. Observers in the courtroom exchanged glances, skeptical of her tale. When it was Daniel's turn, the contrast was striking. His lawyer kept it simple, pointing out that the HOA had no restrictions against holiday displays, that the lights were turned off at 10 p.m. each night, and that no city ordinances had been violated. Then came the witnesses. One by one, neighbors took the stand. Families testified that Daniel's display had been a source of joy, not disruption. Parents described bringing their children to see the lights, calling it the highlight of their holiday season. Even elderly residents spoke warmly of the cheer the display brought to the neighborhood. Karen's face darkened with every testimony. She fidgeted in her seat, whispering furiously to her lawyer, but the tide was turning rapidly against her. When asked to provide concrete evidence that her health had suffered directly because of the lights, her medical bills showed routine doctor visits, but nothing that could be linked specifically to Daniel's decorations. Then came the pivotal moment. Daniel's lawyer produced records showing that Karen herself had decorated her house extravagantly with lights just 2 years prior. Photos from the HOA newsletter revealed her yard glowing with inflatable snowmen, icicle lights, and a giant glowing star. The courtroom fell silent as the images were passed around. Karen's credibility, already shaky, crumbled in an instant. The case is dismissed. The judge's ruling was blunt and unforgiving. Karen's claims were unsupported by credible evidence, her arguments frivolous and lacking merit. The ruling noted that her lawsuit had wasted valuable court resources and hinted at the possibility of sanctions if she pursued similar actions in the future. Relief washed over Daniel like a tidal wave. Weeks of tension seemed to dissolve in an instant. He read the letter aloud to his wife, and they hugged tightly, both laughing and crying at once. It was over, or at least the legal battle was. But while Daniel's household finally found peace, Karen's world began to crumble. The news spread quickly through Maplewood Pines. Neighbors shared knowing looks, whispered conversations carried across driveways, and soon everyone knew Karen had lost. Not just lost, she had been humiliated. The court's dismissal painted her lawsuit not as a brave fight for justice, but as a petty, vindictive attack. Neighbors who had once nodded politely at her began crossing the street to avoid her. Former allies on the HOA board stopped returning her calls. Even her closest friend in the neighborhood, a woman named Susan, who had occasionally defended her, distanced herself, embarrassed to be associated with her antics. But the humiliation was only the beginning. The court had also ordered Karen to pay Daniel's legal fees, thousands of dollars she didn't have, all because she couldn't tolerate a holiday display. The moment she saw the figure in black and white, she nearly collapsed. Bills piled up quickly. Karen had already borrowed heavily to cover her lawyer's retainer, and now she faced the daunting prospect of paying Daniel's expenses on top of her own. The smug confidence she once carried evaporated. She stopped strutting around the neighborhood, stopped posting long rants online. Instead, she pulled her blinds closed and hid inside, stewing in bitterness. But financial ruin has a way of seeping into every corner of life. Her mortgage payments, once manageable, became a crushing weight. Creditors called daily, their voices stern and unyielding. Karen, who had once prided herself on projecting control and superiority, now found herself unraveling. Meanwhile, Daniel's reputation in the neighborhood soared. Families who had quietly supported him now openly praised him for standing firm. Parents told him how much his display had meant to their children, how it had brought joy during a cold, difficult winter. Neighbors dropped by with congratulations, treats, and notes of support. Even the HOA board, once hesitant to get involved, acknowledged that Daniel had been unfairly targeted. Karen, however, refused to accept reality. Instead of learning from her mistakes, she clung to the idea that she had been wronged. She muttered about filing an appeal, though her lawyer had already abandoned the case. Refusing to throw good time after bad, she complained about bias, corruption, conspiracies, anything to avoid admitting the truth. But the consequences were unavoidable. Within months, her financial troubles became public knowledge. Notices appeared on her door, first subtle, then bold and unmistakable. Foreclosure warnings. Her once pristine lawn grew patchy and overgrown, weeds sprouting where flowers had once been meticulously tended. Neighbors who had once envied her spotless home now shook their heads at the decline. Karen's downfall became a cautionary tale. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Don't be like her. Don't let bitterness consume you. Neighbors who had once tolerated her nitpicking found themselves almost pitying her but not quite. The wounds she had inflicted on the community ran too deep for sympathy. And then came the day no one thought they'd see. The moving truck. Karen's house, once a symbol of pride and authority, now stood as a monument to her defeat. Boxers were hauled out, furniture carried down the steps, and for the first time in years, the street felt light again. Neighbors watched from their windows as Karen stood in her driveway, arms folded, glaring at the world one last time. She muttered angrily to the movers, stomped around the yard, and finally climbed into her car, slamming the door shut with a force that echoed down the block. As the truck rumbled away, a collective sigh of relief swept through Maplewood Pines. Daniel stood on his porch, watching silently. He didn't cheer, didn't gloat. Instead, he simply felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served not just in the courtroom, but in life. Karen's obsession with control had cost her everything. Her money, her reputation, her home. But as peaceful as the neighborhood now seemed, the story wasn't quite finished. Because when people like Karen fall, they rarely go quietly. Rumors soon began to swirl, rumors that she had plans to strike back, that she wasn't done with Maplewood Pines just yet. And Daniel, though grateful for the quiet, couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's shadow still lingered. For most people, losing a lawsuit, facing foreclosure, and being forced to leave the neighborhood would have been the end of the story. A lesson learned, a new chapter elsewhere. But Karen was not most people. Even as the moving truck carried away the last remnants of her life in Maplewood Pines, she clung to her anger like a lifeline. She couldn't accept that she had lost not just the case, not just her home, but her status. For years, she had positioned herself as the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's standards. To admit defeat was to admit she had never held real power at all. So Karen did what Karen always did. The first signs of her desperation appeared online. From her new rental across town, she began posting in local community groups, warning others about the dangers of excessive holiday displays. She wrote long, rambling posts about light pollution, negligent neighbors, and corrupt judges. She painted herself as a whistleblower, silenced by a biased system. But instead of rallying support, her posts became a spectacle. People shared screenshots of her rants with mocking captions. Commenters asked pointed questions about her own history of elaborate decorations, about her foreclosure, about her tendency to turn every dispute into a crusade. Karen, once feared in Maplewood Pines, had become a punchline across the county. Embarrassment only fueled her obsession. She filed complaints with the city council, claiming Maplewood Pines was harboring unsafe traffic conditions during the holidays. She emailed local news stations, pitching her story as an on-neighborhood neglect. None of it gained traction. Her name, once tied to authority, was now synonymous with frivolous drama. Meanwhile, Maplewood Pines thrived in her absence. Freed from her constant surveillance and complaints, the neighborhood blossomed. Families hosted block parties. Children played freely in yards. And the HOA meetings, once dominated by Karen's tirades, became productive and even pleasant. The Christmas lights controversy became a legend, told with chuckles. A reminder of how one person's bitterness could cast a shadow over many, and how swiftly that shadow could vanish once exposed. But Karen wasn't ready to vanish. Unable to regain influence through official channels, she turned to more desperate tactics. She began driving past Maplewood Pines at night, parking at the edge of the cul-de-sac, and watching from her car. Neighbors spotted her silhouette more than once, the glow of her phone lighting her face as she took photos. It was as if she couldn't let go of the place, as if losing her house hadn't severed the cord of obsession. One evening, she marched right up to Daniel's property, snapping photos of his yard while muttering angrily into her phone. Daniel's wife, startled by the intrusion, called the police. By the time officers arrived, Karen was gone, her car speeding into the night. But the incident left the neighborhood shaken. It seemed she was no longer just bitter. She was unhinged. The police report added to Karen's growing pile of problems. Her landlord, already frustrated by her constant complaints about the rental property, warned her that one more incident would result in eviction. Creditors continued hounding her, her finances spiraling further into chaos. Once known for her pristine appearance and polished demeanor, she now looked worn down, her clothes wrinkled, her hair unkempt. The weight of her obsession was visible for all to see. And still, she couldn't stop. In a last-ditch attempt to regain control, Karen tried to sue again this time. Not Daniel, but the HOA itself. She claimed the board had failed to protect her from nuisance neighbors and had enabled harassment. But this time, the court's patience had worn thin. The judge dismissed her case outright, labeling it abusive litigation and warning her that further frivolous filings could result in legal sanctions. It was the final blow. Karen had officially lost every avenue of attack. The courts rejected her. The neighborhood shunned her. The community laughed at her. And her finances were in tatters. Back in Maplewood Pines, Daniel and his family carried on quietly. He didn't celebrate Karen's misfortunes. He didn't need to. The truth was plain for everyone to see. Karen had destroyed herself. All he had wanted was to bring joy to his family with a holiday display. And though it had sparked months of turmoil, in the end, light had triumphed over darkness. But Karen's downfall still held one last chapter. Because when people lose everything's status, reputation, money, they sometimes turn reckless. And as the holidays approached once more, Karen's bitterness, festering unchecked, threatened to erupt in a final act of defiance. The neighborhood thought it had seen the worst of her. But Karen wasn't finished, not yet. By the time the next holiday season rolled around, Maplewood Pines had settled into a new rhythm. The air felt lighter, the HOA meetings more civil, the neighbors more connected. Without Karen's constant complaints, the community flourished. Driveways sparkled with decorations, porches glowed warmly, and children laughed freely in the streets. For the first time in years, Maplewood Pines felt like the idyllic neighborhood it had always pretended to be. Daniel's family prepared for Christmas with renewed excitement. Though the scars of the previous year's ordeal lingered, they refused to let Karen's bitterness steal their joy. They expanded their holiday display, adding new lights, a nativity scene, and a row of candy cane arches that lined the sidewalk. Families from other neighborhoods once again came to visit, and the cul-de-sac was filled with cheer. But as the lights twinkled and laughter filled the night, a shadow loomed just beyond the glow. Karen, she had never truly let go. Living miles away in a cramped rental, burdened by debt and humiliation, she remained obsessed with the place she had lost. Maplewood Pines haunted her. She scrolled endlessly through social media posts of the neighborhood, seething at the photos of block parties and decorations. To her, it wasn't just a community that had moved on, it was a community that had betrayed her. And now, as Christmas returned, her obsession drove her to the brink. It began with small acts of intrusion. A neighbor spotted her car parked at the edge of the street late at night. Headlights off, her silhouette visible in the driver's seat. Another saw her walking briskly past the decorated houses, muttering under her breath, her phone raised to snap photos. Daniel's children grew uneasy when they noticed the same unfamiliar car circling the block multiple nights in a row. Then, one frigid December evening, Karen crossed a line. Around midnight, long after most of the neighborhood had gone to sleep, she crept into Maplewood Pines. Wrapped in a heavy coat, her face obscured by a scarf, she moved swiftly and silently across the lawns. Her target was obvious. Daniel's display, the glowing archways, the reindeer, Santa sleigh, all of it stood as a reminder of the battle she had lost. And in her mind, destroying it would be her revenge. Armed with scissors, she slashed cords and wires. Lights flickered and died, strings of bulbs collapsing into darkness. She toppled inflatable decorations, stabbing holes into them until they deflated with a hiss. Piece by piece, she dismantled the display, her breath visible in the cold air as she worked feverishly, fueled by spite. But Karen underestimated two things: Daniel's preparation and the watchful eyes of the neighborhood. After the previous year's harassment, Daniel had installed security cameras around his property. Every snip of Karen's scissors, every slosh of a cord, every furious tug was recorded in crisp detail. Meanwhile, a neighbor returning late from a holiday party spotted her crouched in the yard and immediately called the police. By the time officers arrived, Karen was still at it, tugging violently at the glowing Santa sleigh. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated her in the act, and she froze, caught in the glow of real authority. For a moment, she tried to protest, claiming she was protecting the community from a hazard, but the evidence was undeniable, and the officers swiftly placed her in handcuffs. The scene drew neighbors from their homes, rubbing their eyes, clutching coats over pajamas. They watched in stunned silence as Karen was led to the police car, her face twisted with rage and humiliation. Some whispered, others shook their heads. A few even recorded videos, knowing this moment would spread far beyond Maplewood Pines. The next day, the footage from Daniel's security cameras went viral. Posted online, it spread like wildfire. A bitter neighbor, once obsessed with control, reduced to vandalizing Christmas lights in the dead of night. Commenters around the world mocked her, labeling her the Grinch of Maplewood Pines. News stations picked up the story, turning her into a cautionary tale of pettiness gone too far. Karen was charged with vandalism, trespassing, and violation of a restraining order that had quietly been placed after her previous harassment. The penalties were severe fines. She couldn't afford community service hours. And yet another stain on her already ruined reputation. For Daniel and his family, the ordeal ended not with bitterness, but with resilience. Neighbors rallied to repair the display, bringing spare lights, tools, and decorations. Within 2 days, the yard was glowing brighter than ever, a defiant symbol of joy that no act of spite could extinguish. Children cheered as the lights flickered back to life, and the cul-de-sac echoed with laughter once more. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared completely. Her rental was vacated within weeks, her whereabouts unknown. Some said she moved out of state. Others claimed she was staying with relatives. But to Maplewood Pines, it didn't matter. She was gone, and for the first time in years, truly gone for good. As the year came to a close, Daniel stood in his driveway, watching his children chase each other beneath the candy cane arches. The lights glowed warmly. Neighbors waved cheerfully, and for once, the night was free of shadows. Karen had tried to take everything from him, peace, joy, even his home, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. And Maplewood Pines, bathed in the glow of holiday lights, stood as a testament to a simple truth. Pettiness may cast a shadow, but in the end, light always wins.